On the morning of February 7th, 1944, a Royal Navy destroyer escort cutting through the gray chop of the English Channel at 24 knots became the involuntary proving ground for the most ridiculed weapons program in the history of aerial warfare. The weapon that found it had no gyroscope, no radio receiver, no electronic guidance system of any kind. It weighed 94 pounds. It had 3 pigeons sealed inside its nose cone, each trained to peck at a projected image on a small screen, each peck physically deflecting the control surfaces of the bomb through a simple mechanical linkage. The National Research Defense Committee had authorized $25,000 for the initial study. B.F. Skinner, the Harvard psychologist who designed the system, had been turned away by 3 separate military review boards before a fourth, desperate enough to listen, gave him a converted wooden shed and a cage of birds. When Hermann Göring received his intelligence briefing on the program in late 1943, he reportedly laughed for 40 seconds before declaring it the most idiotic thing the British had ever attempted. He was wrong about almost everything. Standard military thinking in 1943 emphasized electronic precision. The German Fritz X radio-guided bomb, which had sunk the Italian battleship Roma on September 9, 1943, with a 3,161-pound armor-piercing warhead, guided by a Luftwaffe operator watching a flare in the bomb's tail, represented the future that every major power was racing toward. The American Azon bomb used radio azimuth control. The British were simultaneously developing their own television-guided systems. Every serious weapons engineer agreed that guidance had to be electronic, had to be remote-controlled, and had to be immune to the organic failures that plagued any system dependent on living components. A pigeon could panic, a pigeon could get airsick, a pigeon could simply stop pecking. Critics within the British military establishment argued that Skinner's Project Orcon, short for Organic Control, was not a weapons program, but an elaborate psychological experiment being funded with war money. They were right about the biology and completely wrong about what the biology could actually do. The secret was in how Skinner had solved the reliability problem that his critics assumed was unsolvable. Between 1941 and 1943, working at the General Mills laboratory in Minneapolis, Skinner had trained pigeons using operant conditioning to peck at specific shapes with an accuracy and consistency that shocked every engineer who witnessed a demonstration. A pigeon trained on the silhouette of a Kriegsmarine destroyer would ignore every other shape on the projected screen and peck only at its target, maintaining contact through the peck deflection system with an accuracy of approximately 2 to 3 inches on the projection plate, which translated, through the bomb's mechanical linkage, to control corrections precise enough to steer a falling weapon toward a target from an altitude of 5,000 feet. A single pigeon achieved this. 3 pigeons, Skinner discovered through systematic testing of 64 birds across 4,800 trials, created a voting mechanism. If 2 of 3 birds pecked at the same point on the screen, the control surface moved. If one bird panicked or lost the target, it was outvoted. The system's redundancy was not electronic backup circuitry. It was behavioral statistics applied to 3 small animals in a padded compartment. The Fritz X, which Göring held up as the obvious technological superior, had a fundamental vulnerability that no German engineer had adequately solved by 1943. It required an unobstructed line of sight between the dropping aircraft and the falling bomb for the entire duration of flight, typically 40 to 60 seconds. The Dornier Doe 217 carrying a Fritz X had to fly straight and level above the target area, while a dedicated operator in the aircraft tracked both the bomb's flare and the target simultaneously through a Kehl-Strasberg radio control unit. During those 40 to 60 seconds, the dropping aircraft was flying straight, level, and predictable at medium altitude, a perfect anti-aircraft gunnery solution. At the Salerno landings in September 1943, HMS Warspite absorbed a Fritz X hit that put her out of action for months, but the attacking Doe 217s were also taking catastrophic losses to Allied anti-aircraft fire, precisely because the guidance requirement forced them to hold their course. On September 9th, alone, 2 of the 6 attacking Doe 217s were shot down during their post-release straight and level runs. The guidance system that Göring called modern required the aircraft to behave like a target. Project Orcon's pigeons required nothing from the aircraft at all after release. This wasn't a minor operational difference. It was the central tactical reality that Skinner had understood from the beginning and that no military review board had grasped until the 1944 demonstration. Once a pigeon-guided bomb left the aircraft was free to maneuver, dive away, take evasive action, or simply leave the target area entirely. The 3 pigeons in the nose were doing their job autonomously, without any signal from any transmitter, without any radio frequency that could be jammed, without any operator whose nerve could fail or whose tracking could be disrupted by flak bursts around the aircraft. The Allies had already discovered by late 1943 that German Fritz X operators lost target tracking when their aircraft was under fire, a natural human response that no training fully eliminated. The pigeon, Skinner noted in his project documentation with characteristic precision, showed no measurable change in pecking accuracy when subjected to vibration loads equivalent to heavy anti-aircraft fire. He had tested this specifically, strapping trained birds into vibrating platforms designed to simulate combat conditions. The error rate increased by 4.3% under maximum vibration. Human Fritz X operators under the same psychological stress showed tracking degradation of 23 to 31%, according to Luftwaffe's own post-mission analysis. The February 1944 demonstration against the destroyer escort confirmed what the laboratory data had suggested. The test weapon, dropped from a Bristol Beaufighter at 200 feet, adjusted its trajectory 4 times during the 34-second fall, each correction initiated by the pigeon voting mechanism as the target ship's silhouette drifted from center screen. It struck within 6 feet of the waterline amidships, not a direct hit on the specific aim point, but well within the lethal radius for a 94-pound warhead against a destroyer-class vessel. The 3 naval officers observing the test said nothing for approximately 10 seconds. The senior officer present, a commander whose name appears in the demonstration report only as Seagay Dr. H.W., wrote in his after-action notes that the system demonstrated guidance consistency superior to that observed in operational Fritz X deployments. He recommended immediate operational testing with a 500-pound warhead. The recommendation moved up the chain. What made this work wasn't the pigeon's intelligence, a point Skinner was meticulous about clarifying. The birds were not understanding the mission. They were not reasoning about naval warfare. They had been conditioned through 200 to 400 individual training sessions each to associate a specific visual stimulus with a physical action that produced a food reward. The sophistication was entirely Skinner's, in the system design that converted a simple pecking behavior into a precise mechanical control input, and in the 3-bird voting architecture that made individual animal variation statistically irrelevant. A single pigeon trained to peck at destroyer silhouettes would maintain that behavior under conditions, darkness, vibration, altitude-induced pressure changes, that would cause a human operator to hesitate, reassess, or simply lose the target in the confusion of combat. The pigeon had no capacity for reassessment. This wasn't a limitation. It was the entire point. The deeper principle was one that cut across every assumptions the military establishment brought to weapons evaluation in 1943. Conventional wisdom held that organic systems, anything biological, were inherently less reliable than mechanical systems under combat stress. Machines didn't panic. Machines didn't tire. Critics of Project Orcon repeated this axiom at every review board. They were right about machines in general and completely wrong about this specific comparison. The Fritz X was guided by a human being under fire in a straight and level aircraft, while simultaneously tracking a moving ship and a falling bomb, and operating a joystick control. The Pigeon-Guided bomb was guided by an organism that had been specifically selected and trained for exactly one task, that had no stress response to anti-aircraft fire, and that continued performing that task with quantifiable consistency until impact. The question was never organic versus mechanical. The question was, which systems' failure modes were more controllable under combat conditions? Skinner had engineered the failure modes out of the organic system with the same methodological rigor he applied to every behavioral experiment. The military establishment kept evaluating his birds as animals. He had built them into components. The program was canceled in 1944, not because it failed, but because the development of radar proximity fuses and improved gyroscopic guidance systems offered similar accuracy without the logistical complexity of maintaining trained pigeon populations at forward air bases. The official termination memo, dated August 8, 1944, noted that Project Orcon had demonstrated reliable guidance capability, but concluded that the practical difficulties of field maintenance of organic guidance units outweigh the operational advantages in current circumstances. The practical difficulties referred to the fact that pigeons required food, water, veterinary oversight, and acclimatization to forward operating environments, none of which was impossible, but all of which added a layer of biological supply chain to weapons logistics that no quartermaster wanted to manage in 1944 with the Allied armies already across Normandy. Göring's contempt for the program survived his capture. In his Nuremberg prison interviews, he mentioned British radar, British Spitfire production, and British convoy routing as the 3 things that had most frustrated Luftwaffe planning. He never mentioned the pigeons. The intelligence summary of Project Orcon that had crossed his desk in 1943 had apparently not warranted updating in his mental model of British capability. This was itself a kind of verdict. The program he had dismissed as idiotic had demonstrated in a wooden shed in Minnesota and a gray stretch of the English Channel, a principle that would eventually become foundational to precision weapons design, that the reliability of a guidance system is determined not by its sophistication, but by the controllability of its failure modes under the specific conditions where it will actually be used. The Germans had built the more sophisticated weapon. The British had built the more reliable one. In the history of warfare, that distinction has almost always resolved in favor of reliability.